All right, so we're just gonna get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the California Resources Board Research Seminar for Contract 20RD006, which is titled Measuring, Analyzing, and Identifying Small Area Vehicle Miles Travel Reduction. My name is Jose Lopez. I am an air pollution specialist in the research division, the contract manager for this study, and I also will be helping facilitate some portions of the seminar today. We will do a quick icebreaker here just to get a feel of who is in this virtual room today with us. So I encourage everybody to type in the chat where you're joining us from today, your location, your city, and if you are representing any organization. And soon you will see that icebreaker question in the chat. So again, I encourage you to type in the chat, where are you joining from today? And if you are affiliated with any organization. We'll take a pause here just to acknowledge everybody joining here. Start seeing some people from Sacramento, or feeling quickly here. Sacramento, folks joining from Caltrans, from SAE as well, from LA. Central Coast Commission from San Francisco. From Davis, Orange County, or Orange, Santa Rosa. Current Council of Governments. LA, Newberry Springs. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Appreciate everybody for joining us from different various parts of the state. So we'll just continue with the next few slides. This is our agenda for today. It's fairly simple. And I will just kick it off with some housekeeping items. As you know, this meeting is being recorded. The recording will be made available in the YouTube channel in about 1 week from today. And so also we will be dropping a link to that YouTube channel so you can find this recording in a week from now. Also, if you want to speak or make a comment, I encourage you to use the hand raise feature or type your comments in the chat. Also, note that the chat will be saved as well. And you can find the final report in today's presentation in the contract webpage. We will be posting that webpage in the link as well. So you can find, again, the final report and today's presentation in this contract's webpage. I will be providing an overview of the contract in the next slide. And after I do that, we will have a presentation from Dr. Susan Handy. And after the presentation from Dr. Susan Handy, we will have a time for question and answer period. And I highly encourage you to voice your comments or questions verbally by using the chat. And please use the hand raise feature if you wish to speak. So this can help us keep track of all the speakers. After the question and answers, we will just wrap it up and end the seminar. Okay, so just a contract overview. The motivation for this study was to support the goals of Senate Bill 375, as 375 requires the metropolitan planning organizations to create sustainable community strategies that integrate transportation, land use, and housing policies, to plan for how vehicle miles travel and associated greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced to meet California climate goals. The contract aimed to document on the ground changes in the built environment, explore the contribution of local and or regional policy change in public and private investments, and assess whether changes in vehicles miles travel occurred over the same period in the selected downtown case study areas of Sacramento, Santa Monica, and Fresno, as one way to test the effectiveness of the strategies. And the principal investigator for this study is Dr. Susan Handy. She's a professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis, where she teaches in the Environmental Policy Analysis and Planning major and in the Transportation Technology and Policy program. She's also the director of the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, and her research focuses on the relationship between transportation and land use, particularly in the impact of land use and travel behavior, and on strategies for reducing automobile dependence. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Susan Handy to begin the presentation and tell us more about this project and the findings.
Thank you. Let's see. So it look like I'm sharing the right slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. Well, thank you all for being here to listen in to this overview of our project. I first want to thank my team at UC Davis, Amy, Ashley, Elham, Tatsuya, and Claire, all of whom, except Claire, have by now graduated. And then also a big thank you to Jose and Sarah at CARB, who were with us throughout this project. So, of course, the sort of underlying motivation for this project stems from Senate Bill 375, which put in place targets for per capita GHG emissions reductions by reducing vehicle miles of travel, and put in place a requirement that that metropolitan planning organizations prepare a sustainable community strategy in conjunction with their regional transportation plans. So for all of this to work, we need some change at the local level. The underlying assumptions of SB 375 are that changes in the built environment will lead to changes in travel behavior. And we do have quite a bit of evidence that supports that assumption. If you're interested in seeing that evidence, I suggest that you Google SB 375 research, and you will find the Air Resources Board page for some work we did about a decade ago, looking at the evidence that's out there on this question. And just a plug for an ongoing project, we're in the process of updating all of that synthesis of the research right now. The second underlying assumption, of course, is that local policies can actually bring about changes in the built environment. And this is actually a question that we don't have a lot of good evidence on. We always assume this is going to be true, but it may not be a real straightforward process to go from local policy to changes in the built environment. And then there's even what I think of as the upstream question from that, which is how does state policy nudge local policy in the right direction? And again, my group at UC Davis is doing some work on those questions. So stay tuned for that. Now, the point about the evidence on the effect of the built environment on travel behavior, we do have a lot of evidence. But most of that evidence is cross-sectional. And that's important for this reason. So cross-sectional research, we're comparing one place to another at a given point in time. And so what cross-sectional research allows us to do is look at the association between differences in the built environment and differences in travel behavior. We have so much of this evidence because it's easier to do because you need data for only one point in time. And it's a really important starting point because it shows us whether or not there's an association between the built environment and travel behavior. But it doesn't go very far at establishing causality. To be more certain that changes to the built environment will lead to changes in travel behavior, we need longitudinal research at more than one point in time. It's longitudinal research that allows us to answer the question, are changes in the built environment associated with changes in travel behavior over time? Because it requires data at two more points in time, it is much harder to do than cross-sectional research. So we have very little longitudinal research on this question. So that was one of the goals of this project, was to provide a little bit of that longitudinal look at the link between on-the-ground changes to the built environment and whether that could, in fact, lead to a reduction in car dependence. So project goals document changes in travel behavior resulting from changes in land use patterns and the transportation system. And in our case, we're focusing on specific case study areas. Partly this is for practical reasons because the longitudinal data are not readily available for large samples of places. So it's not really possible yet, although soon maybe, to do a big scale statistical sort of analysis. But also we took this approach because case studies provide a more holistic assessment of the changes in the selected communities. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. But in essence, what we were doing here was what's called a natural experiment. So we are studying something that's happening out in the real world and trying to assess whether that has led to changes in the outcome of interest. So we've got two parts to this. One is, first, did local policy changes contribute to on-the-ground changes in the built environment? And two, did on-the-ground changes contribute to changes in travel behavior, specifically VMT reductions? So here's a nice graphic depiction of what we were doing in our study, and maybe this is helpful for you to better understand what we were setting out to do. So the influence of policies and programs on the transportation system as well as land use, and did any of that lead to a change in vehicle miles of travel? We, of course, also considered other things going on that could affect this. So market forces clearly have a role to play, especially with land use changes, and then other conditions that could have been affecting travel behavior. So before I get into the results, just a few more sort of caveats here, some of the challenges we faced in doing this work. One has to do with timing. And again, timing is always a challenge when you're doing longitudinal work. So one thing that's important to note that this is a retrospective rather than a prospective study. So we were here starting in 2021, I think it was, looking back over time to see if we could find evidence of change, rather than looking forward and documenting change as it happens. So, prospective studies take some patience because they take time, but a retrospective study, it's just hard because we are not sort of designing data collection from the start, right? We have to depend on what data are going to be available to us. There are lots of lags in the timing of the things we're looking at. So there's a lag between when policies are adopted and when on-the-ground changes happen. There may be some lag between when on-the-ground changes happen and when significant changes in travel behavior then result. There is certainly a lag between when changes in travel behavior happen and when we have data available to us that can show us what those changes are. And then in our case, we also had the COVID-19 pandemic, which changed everything. So we made the choice to define our study period as roughly 2000 to 2019 to avoid the COVID mess. And then I want to make a point that, of course, changes are ongoing in all three of our case study communities. So the on-the-ground changes are still happening. The changes in travel behavior are still happening. So although this is a longitudinal study, it's still just a snapshot of what's going on in these cases. Other challenges, policies happen in bundles. Built environment changes happen in bundles. This makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for us to isolate the effects of specific policies or specific changes to the built environment. On the plus side, with our case study approach, what we are able to do is to see the synergistic effects of all of this, and that's that's where the holistic nature of our case studies is beneficial. It lets us see how it all works together. And then the other really big challenge, as you will soon see, is that the available travel behavior data at these very small scales is limited in both quantity and quality, which means that our results are not conclusive, but we believe, you know, it's still useful to look at what data there are and to see what it suggests about the effect of these on the ground changes. The data issue, I'm going to come back to that at the end, because that is an issue for large scale statistical sorts of studies as well. We just do not have a lot of great data about what we're looking at here. At least we don't in a retrospective sort of way. So certainly these case studies are not definitive in any way, but I would argue that they are an important complement to whatever sort of larger sample quantitative studies people may be able to undertake in the future. Okay, so our 3 case study areas, Central Sacramento, not sure why we call it Central rather than downtown. I'll show you a map in a minute. Downtown Fresno, downtown Santa Monica. And I know there's some of you out there from these places, so I'm sure you'll have comments for me at the end. Some things to note about these 3 case studies. They have historical similarities in terms of their physical built environment characteristics. They are all 3, settled well before World War II, and they have the kind of built environment characteristics that go along with that. Obviously, they have some pretty big economic differences, not only now, but over time. Very different economic base in each of these communities. And as you'll see, some pretty big differences in income levels. And then with respect to policies, well, that's what we took a close look at. There were actually some very similar sorts of things happening, or at least being talked about in these communities, but I think some important differences in terms of the timing of policies and maybe some of the aggressiveness of the implementation of the policies. So Santa Monica, here are the boundaries there. And you'll notice we have sort of a fuzzy edge, because depending on what sort of data we were looking at, the boundaries may vary a little bit. Sacramento, slightly smaller area. And, freeways are a pretty good way to define areas that create some very strong boundaries around communities. And then Fresno, an even smaller area there. All right, so the first part of what we looked at was this question about what changed on the ground and why. What role did policies play in bringing about that change? What else was going on? So we used a whole bunch of different data sources. Obviously, we looked at general plans, specific plans, transportation plans, other public documents, newspaper and other media articles, interviews with local planners, some convenient use of Google Street View to verify when a bike lane actually did show up on the street. American Community Survey data from the Census Bureau that gives us some useful demographic data, and then some site visits as well to ground truth things. So I'm going to start with Santa Monica and then again Sacramento, Fresno, and talk about what happened in each place. And then we'll turn to the second question, which is to look at what is the evidence of impact on travel behavior. So Santa Monica, I think really got started the earliest of these 3 case studies. They had some lofty ambitions even before the 2000s with respect to their general plan and other sustainability planning that they were doing. One of the key policies that they adopted was the land use and circulation element known as the LUCE. That was 2010, the goal of which was to coordinate land use and transportation and set very ambitious goals for infill and for changes in travel behavior. This was followed by a bicycle plan, zoning code update, downtown community plan, among other policies. Our sense from our research is that the implementation of the policies were maybe not as ambitious as the original plans, given some backlash from residents of the city, as well as some turnover in the city council. But even so, the policies led to some notable changes. So there has been quite a bit of infill housing development as well as commercial infill over this period. Some important street improvements, some important public facilities like the new library, the light rail opening, the expo line opening in Santa Monica, and then scooter and bike share were important there as well. So if we look at the American Communities Survey data on housing units, 2010, 2015, 2019, you can see the increase in housing units in the case study area. And in fact, housing units increase faster in the case study area than the city as a whole and then in the county, suggesting that policies did have some impact along with market forces on bringing more housing and more residents to the case study area. With respect to income, incomes increased faster in the case study area, although they were lower in the case study area than the city as a whole, though both the case study area and the city as a whole are quite a bit higher than Los Angeles County. So given this faster increase in incomes in the case study area, it is important to consider the possibility that there was gentrification and some displacement going on, which is not something we studied, but would be important to consider when we evaluate the transportation changes that I'll report in a couple of minutes. All right, Sacramento, key policy for Sacramento was the 2030 general plan adopted in 2009. That was followed by a lot of other important plans, a zoning code update, a central community plan, well, another general plan update and a central community plan, bicycle plan, central city specific plan, and a transit-oriented development ordinance. There was clearly a lot of political support for these policies in Sacramento, as well as a lot of staff support in implementing them over the time. But note that these policies are relatively late in the study period, meaning that our analysis with the data available to us may not be picking up the full impact of these policies, both in terms of changes to the built environment on the ground, but also then to changes in travel behavior. As I noted, this is all very much ongoing. So some notable on-the-ground changes in the Sacramento area having to do with bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, as well as street redesign, bike share, car share came along later in the period. Of course, there was the Golden One Center downtown and the redevelopment of that commercial core that went along with that. And as in Santa Monica, there was quite a bit of infill housing development during the period. So again, the American Community Survey data show that housing units increase faster in the case study area than in the city or the county, supporting what was reported by the city. And then with respect to incomes, as in Santa Monica, incomes increase quite a bit faster in the case study area than the city as a whole, and then in the county in this case, although incomes were lower in the case study area than they were in the surrounding areas. So again, this hints at the possibility of gentrification and displacement, which we did not analyze, but should be kept in mind when we think about changes in travel behavior. So on one hand, this increase in incomes could dampen any reductions in VMT, since higher incomes are associated with more driving. On the other hand, this could be helpful from the standpoint of reducing driving if the alternative had been for the people who moved into the case study area to have lived in more suburban areas associated with more driving. So again, it's a little hard to tease out the effects of these income changes. All right, and then our third case was Fresno. Fresno started early with both transit planning and a downtown vision plan, but then was seemingly a bit slower in terms of putting in place policies to implement those visions. So the Fulton Corridor Specific Plan and the Downtown Development Code came in 2016, along with a Downtown Neighborhoods Community Plan. So again, some of the important policy work has happened relatively recently, meaning that the changes to the built environment and changes to travel behavior may still be to come. On the ground changes, Fresno got their ballpark early in this study period. There was the Fulton Street reconstruction that happened, the launch of a bus rapid transit line in 2018. And then, like the other two case studies, quite a bit of infill housing development on the order of 600 units or so. And that shows up when we look at the American Community Survey data, where the housing units in the case study area increased at a rate about twice the increase for the city and for the county. And then the income story is different than in the other two case study areas. So in this case, incomes in the case study area increased at a far slower rate than they did for the city and for the county, and were the median was quite a bit lower than the surrounding areas. So it does not appear in this case that the policies have contributed to gentrification, which is arguably a good thing, but it does point to continuing economic disparities between the case study area and the rest of the city of Fresno. All right, so that's what changed in terms of policy and on the ground built environment. The second part of what we did was to look for evidence of changes in travel behavior. And as I've already warned you, part of the story here is that there's not a lot of great data, or in terms of quantity and or quality. So what was available to us were, with respect to data for multiple years for all three case studies, we have two categories of sources. So one is the American Community Survey, which I'll talk about next. And then also household travel surveys, two done at the national level, for which there's a good California sample, and then two done by California. And again, I'll talk more about those. And then we also look for city-specific data sources that were not as helpful as we had hoped. So in the report, you will see everything that we had here. Because we have limited time, I'm just going to show you a few highlights of our data analysis. And then another thing I want to point out is that the data on vehicle miles of travel is really limited, but there is better data on other aspects of travel behavior, particularly modes of travel. So that's most of what I'm going to show you, is looking at trends in mode share. And that's useful because it's evidence of a potential shift in VMT. So the American Community Survey, an annual survey conducted by the US Census Bureau, they collect data on household car ownership, which is useful. And then they have one question on, for workers, what is their usual commute mode? So it's important to note that this is not all travel that people are doing. This is just commuting, and all we know is the mode. We analyzed it for the case study district, but also the city and the county. And that's important so that we can look at the trends in the case study area versus the trends in those other areas. And you'll see that in the graphics. And then I also want to note that we use the ACS 5-year estimates where they take, so the 2019 data are actually an average of, or a compilation of 5 years worth of this survey data. And we did that because these case study areas are very small. And even though it's the Census Bureau, these are still relatively small samples. So by using the 5-year estimates, we get a bigger sample and we get more certainty around the results. All right, so let's look at what the ACS says about the drive to work mode share. And I've got Santa Monica on the left, Sacramento, and then Fresno, case study, city, county for each. And then the blue is 2010, the orange is 2015, and the gray is 2020. So you can see it's a little all over the place and not as consistent as we might have liked. The trend is downward for Santa Monica. It's pretty stable for the Sacramento case study area. And the drive to work mode share actually went up for the Fresno case study area. So that's a mixed story. But what's more encouraging is that the shares are lower in the case study areas than the surrounding areas in all 3 cases. So you put that together with the increase in housing that we saw in these case study areas, and that's good news for the goal of reducing VMT. And then the converse of that, transit to work mode share. Again, it's not such a clear pattern. It bounces around a bit, and that's because transit shares are very low. So now we're talking about very small samples in the case study areas. But from 2010 to 2020, actually, sorry, that should be 2019, actually, not 2020. It was up in Santa Monica, but down in Sacramento and a little bit down in Fresno. Transit mode shares are higher in Sacramento and Fresno case study areas than in the surrounding areas. Again, that's a positive thing if we have more people living in these areas where transit seems to be more viable. But that was not true for the Santa Monica case. And then finally, the walk to work mode share. The trend was up for Santa Monica, down a bit for Sacramento, and down a bit for Fresno. But the share was quite a bit higher in the case study areas than in the surrounding areas, although City of Santa Monica does pretty well as well. But these cores, there's a whole lot more walking going on there. And again, with more people living in these areas, that's a positive outcome. All right, now let's turn to the travel survey data. So we had, as I said, 4 of these surveys, 2 from the National Household Travel Survey, 2 from the California Household Travel Survey. In this case, we're showing you data for the case study area and then the city as a whole. We've got data on auto ownership for households. And from these travel surveys, we can calculate vehicle miles of travel in this case for residents living in that case study district or area. And then I will also show you some data on mode share. And here there are a lot of different ways we can do it because the data is collected by household, but we have data on all the trips that people in the household are making. So that means we can look at trip data not only for people living in the district, but also trips that end in the district, trips that start in the district, and then trips that are made wholly within the district. So I'm not going to show you all of that, but that's all included in the report. I do want to note that although these are all for household travel surveys, so that they're generally done the same way, there are some differences in the survey methods, which add to some uncertainty about whether differences we're seeing from one year to the next are real differences or are they artifacts of those differences in survey methods. And in fact, I'm going to show you just the NHTS results for 2009 and 2017, just to make the story a little clearer than if I showed you everything at once. Okay, a couple of caveats with these data. We use zip codes to do this analysis because that was the one geographic unit that was consistent across the 4 surveys. And you can see the zip codes don't perfectly align with how we had defined the case study areas. So again, that adds some uncertainty to what we're doing. And then the really big caveat is that when you get down to these case study areas, these are very small sample sizes. These are the number of households in those different case study areas in those surveys. So although it's a really huge survey for the state, we're a big state. So for any one small area, we just don't, we don't have many households in the survey data. The sample sizes for the trips are much bigger because we have all the trips that those households made. But even there, the sample of trips that we have are coming from this limited number of households. So, so no statistical analysis here because the sample sizes are just too small, and lots of uncertainty about the results. But again, this is what we have. So in our opinion, it's worth taking a look at what the data say, and be nice if they were at least kind of heading in the right direction, even if we can't be certain as to what exactly the numbers are. All right, so let's look at this is from the NHTS median VMT per household member for households living in the case study areas. And this is some good news. 2010 to 2017, sorry, it's 2009 to 2017 is downward for all 3 case studies. So that's where we wanted to be heading. But not necessarily more than for the city as a whole. So on one hand, the downward trend, is good with respect to our goal of reducing VMT. But from the standpoint of determining whether those on-the-ground changes to the built environment contributed to a reduction in VMT, what we want to see is a divergence between the case study area and the surrounding city. Did the changes in the case study area lead to more of a reduction in VMT than otherwise would have happened? So the city as a whole is sort of our control or our counterfactual for what would we have expected the trend to be if all of this change weren't going on. And so really the only one where that works out the way we'd want it to is Sacramento, where for the city as a whole, median VMT went up a bit, but for the case study area, it went down. So we see a greater gap between the case study area and the city, which suggests that maybe those on-the-ground changes did in fact have some impact. Look at Santa Monica, and they both went down. So again, that's what we want to see, but it doesn't help us. Well, it doesn't give us evidence that the changes in the case study area had a differential impact than whatever else was going on in the city. And then in Fresno, VMT went down for both the case study area and the city, but you can see that the gap has narrowed somewhat, which would suggest that the on-the-ground built environment changes have not helped to reduce VMT. And this may go along with what we saw in the ACS analysis, where the driving mode share to work actually went up in Fresno, in the case study area of Fresno. All right, so a bit of a mixed story here, but maybe the most promising results for and then sorry, I'm hearing something, but I'm not hearing it well enough to answer a question. So I'm just going to keep going and we'll be done soon, and then I can answer some questions. So then auto share for trips by residents. Auto shares were down for Santa Monica and Sacramento, but up for Fresno, as we saw with the ACS. But here again, the good news is that auto shares are lower in the case study areas than for the cities as a whole. So moving people into these areas is a good thing from a VMT standpoint. And then walk share for trips by residents is a little more all over the place, but walk share is down for Santa Monica, which is not what we'd want to see, but up for Sacramento and for Fresno. And again, walk shares are higher in the case study areas than in the cities. So the news is a little bit mixed here. But again, maybe most promising in Sacramento. So as I said, lots more data analysis in the full report that you're welcome to dig through. So just to summarize, we found significant built environment changes in all three areas. Increases in housing being a really important part of the story, increases in bicycle infrastructure, street improvements to promote active modes, some big transit improvements for Santa Monica and Fresno, big destinations in Sacramento and Fresno. So some pretty significant built environment changes. These built environment changes resulted from strong political leadership, which helped to push through innovative policies, plans, and programs. Maybe some difference in terms of the aggressiveness with which these policies and plans were implemented. A lot of them still are late in the study period, so a lot of change still potentially to come. And then interested and motivated developers clearly have a really important role here to play as well. A big part of the Sacramento story was the development community. And then limited evidence of a shift in travel behavior. In general, the trends are in the right direction, downward trend in VMT, but of course that's based on very small samples. And driving shares were mostly, but not entirely down, with transit and walking mode shares mostly, but not entirely up. So to consider, the evidence is not conclusive, but it mostly points in the right direction. Limited evidence of a shift in travel behavior because of limited data. And a phrase here that's relevant, I think, is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So just because we haven't found strong evidence of an impact doesn't mean it's not there. It's that we don't have the data to conclusively assess that. Change is slow, both to the built environment and to travel patterns, and it's still in progress. We did see some shifts in demographics, especially income, that may have also dampened the impacts on travel. And then, as I've said several times, the additional housing in these areas is itself a promising sign, given less dependence on driving. One thing we're asked to consider is this question of scaling up. So what, based on what we've learned from these case studies, what should we be thinking about for other communities? Well, of course, one thing to consider is that these case studies, as I noted, are all pre-World War II communities. So it's going to be a different story in suburban areas where it's much harder to bring about, it can be much harder to bring about significant change to the built environment. And we'd have to do some case studies in communities like that to see what kind of effect there's been. And then what policies can the state adopt to foster these kind of changes to the built environment more widely? And of course, the state is already doing all kinds of things to nudge local governments towards changes to their policies that will bring about changes to the built environment. And as I noted earlier, my group at UC Davis is doing a lot of research on these policies and their implementation and how it's all filtering down to the local level. So stay tuned for that. But clearly one place the state could think about more action, if the goal really is to bring about changes to the built environment and reduce VMT, is to think about policies that discourage driving, such as pricing policies and capping highway expansion. So obviously those kinds of policies directly help with VMT reduction, but they could also encourage changes to the built environment that would further support and encourage reductions in VMT. And then just finally, recommendation really is that we need more longitudinal studies of the impact of changes in the built environment on travel behavior. And I think this can go two ways, and probably we need to do both of these things. So the good news data-wise is that we now have a lot of data about travel behavior from our smartphones, most of which is collected by the private sector, but can be available to the public sector for our purposes and to researchers for our purposes. It does not let us go very far back in time, and we need to have some sort of plan or program for making sure that the data are preserved over a long enough period of time that we can test the effect of built environment changes. So let's make sure that the data being currently collected, especially now that we're back to a post-COVID sort of normal, those data are being preserved. So we can do prospective studies of and then the last thing I want to note also is the importance of much smaller scale studies where we do before and evaluations of specific projects. And the state is funding all kinds of things in these communities, from bike lanes to, transit investments and, all kinds of things. And to really understand the impacts of those investments, we need before and after data collection done in a rigorous way. And it's this kind of work that will let us know if this giant SB 375 experiment that California is in the midst of is really working. Whew. All right, that's what I have to say. I think maybe, Jose, should I stop sharing and we can answer some questions?
Yes, let's do that. There's a few questions in the chat, so we can start with that. There are primarily several questions from Craig Jones. So Craig, I don't know if you want to mute yourself and maybe ask your questions, or if I can read through some of the questions you have posted in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was just kind of making observations over time as the presentation happened, and I really appreciate the presentation. I think overall, Susan, I really understand the limitations in the study and the data. It almost raises more questions than it answers. My sense so far is that the jury is still very much out in terms of whether or not incentives for higher density development in sustainable community areas with or without transportation system improvements actually make a difference in overall VMT. I think my most global question is, are we able to look at over time total VMT produced? This is within the context of understanding that it's going to take decades and decades for private automobiles to transition from fossil fuel burning to electric vehicles. Knowing that, then it seems to be very, very important to try to reduce overall gross VMTs. But I mean, does this study information shed any light on that?
Well, the state, meaning the Air Resources Board, has determined that, yes, to meet our goals for GHG reductions, electrification of the car fleet is not enough, that we need to reduce vehicle miles of travel. So that's what Senate Bill 375 is all about, is that goal of reducing VMT. Yeah, and I'm not sure what the other question in there was. Yeah, I guess I feel like we are making some good progress towards changes to the built environment. As I said, the degree to which that depends on policy versus the market, it's clearly a mix of those things. And it's hard to tease out just what is the effect of this specific policy in terms of bringing about how much change. I think, policies like the elimination of parking minimums have the potential to have huge impacts over time. But it takes time, right? So these things are going to play out. So I think the policies are really important, even if there's some questions about how effective they've been. We need the right policies to get the right built environment. It may just be harder than we anticipate it's going to be.
Not enough time has gone
and
by.
then it's just a long, slow process. And in my opinion, so this is kind of off topic of this actual study, the kind of changes to the built environment we're talking about bring so many benefits beyond just VMT reduction that this is probably the right thing to be doing anyway.
Let's hope that's true. It was interesting to note that between the 3 different study areas, that in terms of change of income within the study areas, that Fresno was the outlier, where incomes just increased a little bit over the long period of time, and they actually decreased. One of my colleagues, in looking at environmental and transportation issues, has observed that a lot of the densification that's happening here in the San Diego area is just leading to higher housing costs. Most of the higher density development that's happening is actually very high cost housing. So, and as a general rule, I think we can estimate that higher income households are more likely to rely on automobile ownership than lower income households. That's the evidence that we have in the San Diego region of who actually uses public transportation. So if we're densifying already urbanized areas, but we're doing so with just higher cost housing, are we really discouraging VMT? And wouldn't it be good?
Well, that's a big question that we did not directly study, and yeah, it's a big question.
Okay, so maybe
And
aggressive
it all,
state.
it depends on the counterfactual, like so the people who are now moving into these new developments, where would they have been and what would their travel have been there?
Yeah,
And they may be more car dependent than lower income households living in these areas.
right.
So that's unfortunate. But if they're less car dependent living in these areas than they would have been living in suburban areas, that's a net benefit. So it's a complicated thing to
So
tease out.
one more comment and then I'll shut up. I would love to see the state of California as a whole mandate aggressive inclusionary housing requirements such that we're really building more affordable housing. And the households that get built in our study areas then might be more inclined to use public transportation. Thank you. I really appreciate this presentation.
I think we're voting on that, or at least money for affordable housing.
Thank you, Craig, for all those questions. We'll go to folks that have raised their hand, and then we'll come to some of the other comments or questions we have in the chat. First, I have Caro and then Anis.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, hi, Cara.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Carolina. I'm with the Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego, and I want to make sure we can make this assumption. So could we assume that transit would be a more efficient strategy at reducing VMT at this point, based on the research? Or maybe the other question could be how this evidence is in any way connected to transit or not?
Well, yeah, so transit is important in all three of these case study areas. So yes, it's important to the effort to reduce VMT. I can't tell you how much VMT has been reduced because of the transit in these areas. That's a hard thing to nail down. But the way I think about it is if the goal is to reduce driving, we've got to first make it possible for people to drive less, right? And transit is a big part of that. Walking and biking are a big part of that. Changes in land use are essential to making transit, walking, and biking viable as modes of transportation. We can't just invest in those modes. We need to also be moving towards more supportive land use and land development patterns. And that's how we make it possible to drive less. So that's something that has to be done. And then that doesn't necessarily mean that people will drive less just because you make it possible. I look at Davis, where we've made biking very possible, but a lot of people are still not choosing to bicycle. So the second step is to then discourage driving and nudge people away from driving as the default choice. And that's where what I said at the end becomes important, is that we've got to think about discouraging driving through pricing and by not making driving easier. So again, I'm speaking for me, not CARB, and kind of going beyond what's in the report. But I think in answer to your question, that's what I would say.
Next, we have Anis.
Anis?
All
You
right, now I managed
Great.
to unmute myself. Sorry about that. What I was wondering, I was looking at your Fresno results, particularly with respect to income and versus Sacramento and Santa Monica. And I was thinking, have you also taken into the account, I know that you're looking at the district or area that you're concentrated on and then the city, but how about surrounding metropolitan areas? Santa Monica is obviously close to LA, and whatever happens in LA is going to affect Santa Monica. Likewise, or less so, but similarly, Sacramento is very much influenced by Bay Area home buyers who are moving into Sacramento, making things more expensive for Sacramento folks, and then they have to go out in the suburbs and live there, which is going to increase their VMT because these are the people who are living in the city and working in the city. Now they have to go outside the city. So my question is how, I don't know if your study is completed or not, but would you be able to somehow integrate a larger diameter of the areas, including LA, which is right next to Santa Monica, versus Sacramento, which is about, say, 100 miles or so from the Bay Area, versus Fresno, that doesn't really have any big cities there in the surrounding area.
Yeah. Well, that's, yes, all important context for these case studies addressed to some degree in our write-up, but again, it's very hard to tease out all of these different things happening at the same time. And even with the American Community Survey sort of tracking who's moving into certain areas, where they're coming from, that's a different kind of analysis than what we were doing, but could be pretty insightful. Of course, that tells you about the people, but not necessarily how they were previously traveling.
Yeah.
And there's always the counterfactual problem.
Of course.
So it's very hard to establish causality on any of this.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to get a step closer to that.
The other thing that I was going to also, a comment that I was going to make is maybe what you can also incorporate in this thing. I know that the CHDS and the NHDS are limited to, say, about 3 years or so of study of surveys, but there are other surveys and there are things that are kind of in common between those surveys and the CHDS and NHDS. And for instance, the survey that we do at CEC, which is California Vehicle Survey, includes the number of cars that the households have. So you can compare the number of cars per household from our survey with that of NHDS and CHDS, and that gives you a wider, at least for that one variable, they are comparable to each other. You can make that comparison. And then the third point that I was going to make was when you use the community survey and you had only, you had 2015, I think, 2017 and 2020. The 2020 is, I'm sure you know that, highly questionable because it is influenced by all the things that happened during the COVID time. So
yeah, I had some errors on the graphs. Everything stopped at 2019.
Oh,
not
okay,
look at 2020.
Good,
yeah,
good,
sorry about that.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
I was concerned about that portion.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much.
We do have some data on auto ownership from both the travel surveys and the ACS in the report.
You can complement it with our survey because we have one for 2017 and another one for 2019. So it kind of fills the gap in between these. So in any case, that's what is there.
Thank you. We'll go to Kristen.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really interesting. And I think one of the really interesting recommendations you have is to, pursue better data in the future. I was thinking, do you know of any regions that are doing particularly well at collecting data? I know like the MTC region does a biannual travel survey, and in your professional opinion, do you think that should be like a requirement for regions to collect more data to be able to evaluate whether their policies are successful?
Well, I think it's an important moment to carefully think about what we should be doing with respect to data. Doing a household travel survey is a huge, expensive undertaking. I don't think MTC is doing it every 2 years. Usually these are more like 5 to 10 year schedules. And we did look at the SACOG travel survey in the report. I just didn't share that. Yeah, and then they're getting harder to do. It's harder to convince households to participate. But what's good about that data is we get very rich data about travel and about the people doing the travel. The alternative now, which I think is increasingly being used by the MPOs and other agencies, is the smartphone-based data, like Streetlight, and then there are other companies out there. And so that gives us, oodles of data, like more data than we even need on travel. But we don't have data on the people doing the travel, right? Because that's all
Yeah.
protected data. So yeah, in my opinion, we're gonna need to continue to do the surveys, because there are things we just have to ask people about. But the smartphone data will be really useful. And there's another project that got launched the same time as this one, that out of UC Berkeley, that is looking at the use of smartphone data to track VMT over time. So I don't know, Jose, if you want to say anything more about that.
Yes, we do have a project that is companion to this one, and is utilizing cell phone data to track, understand people's travel behavior a few months before the pandemic and a few months after that. So we have also, this project has also concluded, and we'll have a final seminar in about a month. So I can send out the invitation to everybody here if you want to learn more too.
Thanks. And then just, I don't want to take up too much time, but like in terms of thinking about being really careful about what data we collect, and because you mentioned that, and I noticed that people in the chat were talking about like transit investments, and I was thinking, it seems like mainly when you were looking at the transit policies that were enacted in these case study areas, you were looking at like changes to the built environment. So like if there had been a new station or a new bike lane, but you weren't really looking at like the extent to which maybe like the hours of operation had changed during that time period, or so it was mainly built environment focused.
Yes. Yeah, good point.
Yeah, so it would be
Get
cool to
into
do
that.
both, all sorts of studies, all sorts of data collection. Yeah, thanks.
Wally?
Thank you. I really appreciate your presentation. Its research is so valuable, and not enough of it's done, I think. Anyway, I'm the research director for the South Bay Cities Council of Governments, which is in the southwest corner of Los Angeles County, between the Port of Los Angeles and LAX. And about 15 years ago, we did a very granular study of the interaction between land use and transportation, sort of what happened to smart growth with lots of redevelopment and density and so forth. Marlon Burnett, who I know is a close colleague of yours, was our research scientist.
Mhm.
And we really developed some terrific data. We had great travel data from GPS we put on vehicles, and survey data that Marlon designed and so forth. Anyway, the findings were that it is density of destinations that creates walking. And I see you did not report in your study on the density of destinations, and I'd be very interested to know if you could still do it. That, however, gets below the built environment envelope into who are the occupants of the built environment, because it is they who generate the demand for traffic, both of their requirements for employees to be on site and the requirements for customers to come to the site. But when you look at density of destinations, what you're doing, if you can increase them in destinations per acre, what you get is proximity. And the proximity means not only you get walking, and by the way, Marlon published what I think is a seminal article, and I think it was Urban Affairs, anyway, very important stuff. What you get is through proximity, you can get more walking, but you can also get more cycling, and you can also get more of a mode that's just emerging that we have embraced at the South Bay Cities Council of Governments, which is micromobility. So that is neighborhood electrics, e-bikes, sitting, e-scooters, that whole world. And we have created a local travel network, or we're in the process of creating a local travel network that really makes it safe for those devices to be there. And so that says to me that it's not so much, it's not discouraging driving per se, it's encouraging a different way of driving. And it's not about the carb is all, you know, it's not about it's becoming electrified, although you do become electrified, but it's also about how you get to places without taking up a lot of space, making it more convenient, keeping the door-to-door on-demand service available. Transit, I saw in your charts, doesn't play a very big role in the west side, Los Angeles and Santa Monica. It is 3% in the South Bay. It was, I think, 5 or 6%, despite all of the big blue bus and all the transit they have there. So on the one hand, I'd like to invite you, if you'd like, we have some very rich for longitudinal studies. Come on down and we can share with you some very, very rich granular data if you wanted to do a longitudinal study down here. And it's 15 cities. The other thing that I think is important to consider is that in Santa Monica, which I'm pretty familiar, what's happened over that period of time you studied was it became a huge commercial destination, both for job centers grew tremendously. And so all of the tech industries and stuff moved in and higher income and so forth. And it always has had great transit. But we know when there's more destinations there, the trips get shorter. What isn't measured, we did a little bit in the South Bay, is, excuse me, did a little bit in the South Bay was that the incoming VMT, it's what you see is that you save trips for the locals, but you generate trips that are coming in from somewhere else. So I just have those comments, and if you want to let Marlon know if you want to talk about some sort of longitudinal study, we'd love to have you come down and do something like that.
Well, we love to get funded to do research like that. But yes, Marlon has done some of really the only longitudinal work on changes to the built environment and changes to travel behaviors. So yeah, highly recommend that for anybody who's interested.
Well, if you do go back and look at your destination density, I'd very much love to know what you come up with.
Yes, I mean, this was not a quantitative study, so we don't have a measurement of destination density in there, but these are all downtown areas with destination density, and we looked at commercial infill development. So yes, that's definitely a big part of the story. And as I was explaining, if we're going to try and get people to drive less, we need to make it possible for them to drive less. And that is about density and proximity. And it's not just about investments in the transportation infrastructure, it's about bringing destinations closer together. So yes, I've written lots about that. And
Thank you.
It's a really critical part of the equation. And we do have some analysis of at least mode share for trips into these areas in the report. I just didn't show that. But yeah, it's that's kind of a destination density can be a two-edged sword in that respect.
Well, as someone else mentioned, also, if you combine all this proximity with telework and virtual services, virtual presence, as we're also working on that part because we have our own fiber network that we're connecting to.
Yeah, although the work we're doing on this other project for Air Resources Board, looking at the evidence about various strategies for reducing VMT, remote work is not a clear benefit to VMT reduction. So that one's a little tricky.
Well, I managed the telecommuting pilot project for the city of Los Angeles with my colleague Jack Nillis some years ago, and we have data that says it does. So it's a big deal. I know that there's pros and cons. And all
yeah, the old data said it did. The new data, it's less clear that that's still true.
It also changed on a dime overnight when the whole world became virtual. Yeah. So there you have it.
Yeah. Well, I could say a lot more about it.
Yeah, for sure.
We should be careful about assuming that remote work is helping us towards VMT reduction. It really depends on the context.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wally. We have other comments here in the chat. Susan, just want to give an opportunity. I know Santosh made a few comments. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your questions. You have some questions about data, or if not, I can just read some of the questions or comments you have posted in the chat. I don't know if you're still here.
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't been able to talk and read the comments at the same time. So Jose, if there's something in there you think would be useful to
worries.
comment on.
Yes, I don't think Santosh is here, but he has some questions about the data. One of those Lance was talking about the some of the data that was utilized. I think it was being referred during the household median income in housing. Some of the data that was missing, if there was any data missing, and what kind of data sets were utilized.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of data we would have liked to have. I don't know quite what the question is about missing data.
And I don't think Santosh is here to answer a question. Okay. I'll read another comment here that came in from Doug Eisinger. He's talking about a report from 2009, the NRC report, Driving the Built Environment. A key takeaway that I recall from that, smart growth could result in a regional scale reduction in VNT from 1% to up to 11%. The VNT reduction could be higher, could be greater in smaller size areas in a region, but given that a region is largely built out, the overall regional impact could be more on par with a 1 to 11% range. Would you say that your case study work is consistent with that type of outcome?
Well, I'll go back to the my point about cross-sectional versus longitudinal research. So the report Doug's talking about that's cross-sectional. So it's comparing, smart growth kinds of places to less smart growth kind of places and looking at the difference in travel. So that's an important association. We know that people travel less in places that follow smart growth principles. But that's not the same as showing what's the change in VMT if we make this place more like a smart growth place. And as I noted, we have very little of that kind of longitudinal analysis. And unfortunately, in the cases where we do have some longitudinal analysis, the effect appears to be smaller than when you look cross-sectionally for various reasons. So, I wouldn't quote any specific numbers from our analysis about what is the VMT reduction that one could expect. But I would say that the effect is probably less than what cross-sectional studies would suggest.
Thank you. There's another comment here from Warren. I don't know, Warren, if you're here and if you want to ask your question. Just pause for a second. If not, I can read your question.
Yeah, I'm here. I can
Go for it.
ask the question. Yeah, Dr. Handy, thanks for the opportunity to do this. I know you've been participating in our induced travel impacts of price managed lanes. So, kind of to that line, I was just curious in here. I noticed in these slides on the ground changes, it hadn't addressed some of the highway capacity expansion in it. I don't know if it's been the case for either Fresno or Sacramento, but just reflecting on the expansion of HOV system along the 405 near Santa Monica, and wondering obviously there's a lot to tease out here, but had the study also looked at that highway capacity expansion along the study area? Thanks.
Yeah. So we were focused on the change within sort of the more localized change within these areas. But that's partly your question about the highway capacity. That's partly why we include, or we compare what's going on in the case study to what's happening to the city and the county as a whole. Because everybody in the city and the county is going to be affected by what's being done to the highway system. So, so that's why the comparison between the case study area and the city is really important. You'd expect everybody to be affected by the 405, but then is the change different in the case study area, in which case maybe that's attributable to those localized changes, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Then there's a question from Robin. Robin, I don't know if you are still here and if you want to ask your question. If not, I can read it for you.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, so just in looking at this, in terms of like the SAC area, in the study area there, you know, that's downtown, heavily retail area. You know, is there work being done in how these policy changes, which would improve walkability, which would improve accessibility to services, to retail, to that type of thing, is that being looked at in low income urbanized residential areas? I'm not even going to go into the rural stuff because we don't rate that just yet. But because there's obviously a disconnect of availability in lower income urbanized areas, less availability of green spaces, less availability of fresh fruit, food, vegetables, things like that, transit and regular considered regular commercial outlets. And it feels like this study would benefit in that area as well. Is there work being done in that arena?
Well, yeah, so I would say that's a different sort of question than what we were addressing here, which was really focused on the reduction in VMT goal. What you're talking about, I would characterize as a question of equity of access to, you know, basics like healthy food and other basics. And yes, very important question. And we know that in lower income areas, the access is not as good. But again, I would point to another CARB project that we're involved in that is developing accessibility measures, and accessibility defined as access to goods and services and jobs, as opposed to in an ADA accessibility sense. So, and that's not exclusively focused on equity questions, but equity is a big part of that project, the concerns over equity of access. So yes, there is work going on.
I also want to chime in here and mention that, yeah, we do have other projects that are, you know, sort of looking from different perspectives around equity, and as Susan was mentioning, accessibility. So some of them are undergoing, some of them are about to conclude. So if you have any questions or are interested in maybe any topics, you know, feel free to reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction if you want to learn more.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep, and I think we have time for another question. So if anyone wants to ask the last question. Give it a few seconds here if anyone wants to ask the last question. All right, Jack, go for it. Jack, I see your hand raised. Can you mute yourself?
I guess not.
Okay, Jack, can you hear me? All right, Okay, maybe he's having difficulties. Okay, so I think we'll just, close the meeting. I want to thank everybody for joining. Thank you, Dr. Susan Handy, for the presentation and the report. Appreciate it. Thank everybody in your team as well and everybody that contributed to the project. Emmanuel, do you have a question or comment? Sorry, I can't really hear what you're saying. But if you have any questions or anything, feel free to send an email. Reach out to us. Again, thank you, everybody. And just a reminder, you can find the final report and the presentation from today in our webpage for this contract. I'm just gonna post it one more time here in the chat so you can access it. I'll follow up with an email a few days from now once we have the recording available with all the information and the link so you can find all the information that you need related to this report. And with that, again, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Susan Handy, for the presentation today.
Well, thank you all for being here.